All righty then, I think we'll start. Welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Mark Moore. I'm program associate in the Asia program, which is a totally excellent program. As I see my director, Dr. Robert M. Hathaway, in the back. But it's true, and we cover Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia up through Afghanistan with a minimal staff, but quality is much more important than quantity. And today we're going to do an analysis of the current Japanese political scene, and probably most of you here know all about the current situation. But I'll summarize very quickly. Obviously, last summer in the elections, most observers were stunned, maybe observers who didn't know much about the political situation. But in reading the newspapers, people were shocked that the Democratic Party of Japan, the DPJ, won the upper house elections, and the LDP lost for the first time since its existence. And subsequently, Prime Minister Abe resigned. Prime Minister Yasuo Fukuda was elected by the LDP to be Prime Minister. And Mr. Ozawa in the DPJ is feeling very good at the moment. And the LDP looks a little shaky. So we're going to try to analyze why this all happened and what it means for the future of Japan. And to do this, fortunately, we have some very excellent scholars. This is, after all, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And we have some good ones here today. And let me briefly introduce them to you, speak in the order that they will be speaking. Where's Robert? Okay. On my far right is Robert Pekkanen, who is chair of the Japan Studies Program and assistant professor at the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. His most recent book is on Japan's civil society, entitled Japan's Dual Civil Society, Members Without Advocates, was awarded a prize by the Japanese Nonprofit Research Association. Dr. Pekkanen today will speak on former Prime Minister Koizumi's legacy, what it meant for Prime Minister Abe, and what it means for Prime Minister Fukuda and the LDP. To my immediate left is Dr. Shinju Fujihira, who's Associate Director of the Program on U.S.-Japan Relations at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs of Harvard University. He also serves as a lecturer in political science at Harvard and at Tufts. His most recent article on Prime Minister Koizumi's Northeast Asian diplomacy was published in the Harvard Asia Quarterly. And Dr. Fujihira today will pick up the thread and talk specifically about the LDP, about former Prime Minister Abe and current Prime Minister Fukuda, and where the LDP is and where it's going. After that, we will have, on my immediate right, is Jun Saito, who is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Government at Franklin and Marshall College, and he will speak about the DPJ, and he's uniquely qualified because as a doctoral student, he ran for the Diet under the DPJ banner and won. This was a by-election, and in the next election was Koichi Kato, so he got creamed, but that's all right. He went back to Yale, where he got his PhD, and he contributes to the academic enrichment of our country. To my far left is Sherry Martin, who's an assistant professor, who's usually an assistant professor at Cornell University, jointly appointed in the government department and the program in feminist, gender, and sexuality studies. But this year she's on is it a sabbatical, Sherry?
No, just a leave.
Just a loan?
Just a leave.
Just a leave for a year at the Weatherhead Center at Harvard. She's the co-editor of Democratic Reform in Japan, Assessing the Impact, a forthcoming book. And she will be talking about the what I like to say is the psychic state of the Japanese electorate, trying to do do an analysis of why it seems that current politicians are not connecting with an emphasis on the female electorate. Okay, so that's enough for me, and so let's start with Dr. Pekkanen.
Mark, may I interrupt just a
Sure.
minute? The signals we are getting seemingly from outer space, in fact, coming from someone's BlackBerry.
Oh, okay.
There's someone up there. If you have a BlackBerry, either there or in the audience, if you cut it off, I think we will not get that interference. Thanks.
Thank you, Rob.
Okay. That's mine. I'm going to put it on airplane mode because that's also got my timer.
Oh, okay, good.
Okay.
All right, Dr. Pekkanen.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. Washington, D.C. is my hometown, and I always like to come back. And it's my charge today to talk about Koizumi's legacy and evaluate change in Fukuda's LDP. And this is, I think, a good topic to consider because of the incredible drama that we saw in the summer's elections. The LDP, which experienced a historic victory, crashing to a defeat of equally catastrophic magnitude. And this raises the question of, well, Koizumi, how important was he? Can the LDP win without him? And all sorts of issues in the future of Japanese politics. I'm going to try to look beyond the issues of the moment and try to give you a structural analysis about some fundamental changes in Japanese politics that Koizumi read well, Koizumi exemplified, and talk about how those are continuing and touch a little bit on how Abe and Fukuda had a different way of reacting to those fundamental changes. Okay. So my focus will be on party organization. I'm going to try to look at these three discrete aspects. This is what I'm going to talk about. Factions and personnel, ministers, and I'm going to emphasize to you that I think ministers are really the faces of the party. That's something that's become increasingly important, but it's something that we'll see, for example, in Dr. Fujihira's talk about the way that scandals among the ministers really damaged the Abe administration. Ministers are increasingly important, so choosing ministers, something Abe was faulted for doing poorly, is something that's increasingly important to the prime minister. And elections, the role of the prime minister, again, that's something that is nicely framed by Koizumi's success and Abe's disastrous failure. Now, there's, of course, lots of ways that we could compare Koizumi, Fukuda, Abe. These are the ways I'm going to try to focus on. And each of them, I think that Koizumi is really simply, perhaps that doesn't do him justice, but he is the most dramatic manifestation of some fundamental changes. And those are the ones I'm going to focus on today. For all of these, Fukuda is going to continue trends, which Koizumi didn't necessarily start, but Koizumi made the most of. Koizumi understood well, instinctively, and played to his political advantage, but which Abe didn't appear to grasp as keenly and appeared to have misread. The first issue is factions. There was a lot in the press about factions, the comeback of factions. And this had to do with the way that Fukuda was selected as prime minister. And this is the second prime minister in a row selected, doesn't have a mandate, didn't win a general election. And the DPJ, especially Hatoyama, but others, painted this as a return to the smoke-filled room deal-making style of LDP. In other words, disregarding public opinion. We see faction leaders meeting again, selecting who's going to be the party president and thus inevitably the prime minister of Japan. And it's a return to the 1980s, the 70s, the 60s, the old-style LDP. Is that the case? Well, no, not at all. In fact, there's a lot less here than meets the eye. Factions have undergone a fundamental transformation, although somewhat puzzlingly, they still exist. Doesn't seem to be a really good reason for them to still exist. We can talk about those in the Q&A if you'd like. Right now, I'd just like to focus on the way factions selected or played a part in the selection of the LDP party president for Fukuda. Unlike earlier times, in this case, as we see media reports of faction leaders asking their members permission to open discussions with candidates, to talk with candidates, to make decision. That's really not the old kind of boss-led factions. We see a lot more internal democracy, if you want to call it that, certainly a lot more consultation. And this reflects the much weaker tie between the faction leader and the faction members. The faction leaders have got a lot fewer carrots to offer their members, so they need to be much more consultative. More importantly, factions split their votes. So the way that factions played a role in selecting the prime minister is completely different. It's not the old game of stack up the factions until you get to 50% plus one, the minimum winning coalition, and then you're prime minister. Here we see factions, members of the same faction voting in different ways. So the way factions played a role is completely different. And we see that it's really these trans-factional alliances or groups across factions that win the day. Really, I think it's members deciding this as much as leaders. And we have data on that as well. Now, of course, voting for the party president is a secret ballot, but media reports and multiple sources give us a pretty good idea of how people actually voted. And if we look at them by faction, my apologies, I'm sure it's absolutely impossible to read the bottom line there, but if anyone can, then you can point. You can point. All right.
As soon as you
Even for Mark, it might be hard.
I can read
But you can see that the single white faction, white are the number of faction members who voted for ASO. And the, let's call it crimson in honor of our
Purple.
Purple, okay. Purple is Fukuda. And you can see that there are two factions, two small factions that voted all for Fukuda. One, the ASO faction, voted all for ASO. But otherwise, the factions are all split. And the far right are the people who are not in factions formally. And the far left is Fukuda's faction, the Machimoto faction, which voted more for him, but not even the same proportion of the smaller factions. But the point to take away from this graph is that the factions are split. We don't see factions all voting for one person or another. The factions themselves are divided. And that's because there's a completely different logic to how faction members are going to select who they vote for the party president. They don't simply listen to the old faction boss and go in. So it's not this, the deal making that went on before. Faction members to a much greater degree are making up minds for themselves. But this is not new. This is not the first time. In fact, this is really the pattern that has existed since the mid-1990s. Factions are not crucial to choosing the prime minister any longer, and despite what people may have thought after the most recent election, that remains the case. We can see from the data that Fukuda's selection was not a return to the dominance of faction in choosing the prime minister. So in that way, what we see in Fukuda's selection really just continues the trend that we saw with Koizumi and indeed with Abe. Well, from choosing the prime minister, the next topic I'd like to discuss with you is choosing a cabinet, ministerial selection. And this is an absolutely crucial task for a prime minister in any democracy, because the cabinet is disproportionately influential on voters and on policy making, and of course it's the locus of the aspirations of party politicians. All legislators would love to be prime minister, I assume, but most of them realize that they're not going to make it. But they can all have a pretty good chance and have an expectation of becoming minister. So here, again, I'd like to just compare the old system with what's going on now, looking specifically at Koizumi, Abe, and Fukuda. I'm going to argue to you that Fukuda simply continues a trend which Koizumi magnified, Koizumi exemplified. But the changes represent the fundamental change. So in that way, Fukuda is carrying on Koizumi's legacy. And I'll talk a little bit later how he's carrying on a little bit better than Abe did. Factions or cabinets used to be constructed with a very careful attention to factional balance. So in choosing the faction, prime ministers would select people in rough proportion to the faction, with factional strength in the legislature. There was also a very surprisingly rigid lockstep seniority. So you would know when you would become a cabinet minister based simply on the number of times you were elected. Merit didn't have that much to do with it. If your number came up, the right number of terms, you would go in. And there was a fairly quick rotation to open up spots. So this is the old style cabinet making. Koizumi cabinets seem to diverge dramatically, flashily, from this pattern. And Koizumi made a big deal about how he was pursuing a completely different way of choosing his cabinet from what people had done before. He famously disregarded factions. Doesn't matter what faction you're in, even if you're not in a faction, Koizumi is going to choose based on merit. And he put in outsiders, non-legislators. which is a particularly bitter pill for legislators to swallow. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but the short version is that they're taking your spot. So putting on non-legislative, you better have a very good reason to put in somebody who's not a Diet member. And he kept many, in office much longer. So he seemed to be going against all the trends, all the textbook for how to choose a cabinet, how to run a cabinet. Koizumi seemed to be violating it all. And all of this was, however, part of a trend in cabinet making because of electoral reform, which made party label so much more valuable. And Koizumi understood that very well, the importance of the cabinet, the importance of party label to winning elections. Now, I have what I think immodestly is a great academic paper, extremely fascinating to me and perhaps 30 other people in the world. I won't go into too much detail on that. But we argue that using the party goals literature and academic literature, that what we see in the LDP is a change from valuing different goals. Office seeking is one goal parties have, policy making is another, vote seeking is another. Office seeking behavior, as we call it, has declined. Now, office-seeking behavior, it has kind of a nasty sound to it, perhaps, but it's natural that politicians are ambitious and want to have good positions for themselves, to influence policy, to have power, to secure their re-election prospects. And an important role of the party is constructing rules and managing that ambition. After all, the LDP split and splits had to do a lot with people frustrated that they're not going to be able to become party leader, they're not going to get their share of positions. But this is true for any party in the world. So that's why there are often rigid rules about how people gain seniority and who gets to be, for example, chairman of committees or chairs of committees, depending on seniority. That's very common around the world. And so the LDP developed very strong rules, norms, about how this would be done. And factional balancing was one of them. It became understood that factions, depending on their strength, would be given a roughly proportional number of seats in the cabinet. But we see a decline after electoral reform, when other things, I'll talk about in the next slide, become more important. And the average proportionality declines from 87% to 74%. Now, that doesn't necessarily sound like a huge deal. But actually, 87%, it's hard to get much higher because of the limited number of cabinet posts. And this is a really significant decline. So factional balancing has become less important, not just in the Koizumi period, but in all cabinets after electoral reform. Factional membership itself is less important, and seniority is much less important. As I said earlier, it used to be the case that you could pretty much tell when you were going to be put into the cabinet. 96%, and this is quite startling. For example, 1980 to 1993, 96% of first-time cabinet appointments were on schedule and nobody came in early. So you would have an expectation, I'm elected X number of times, I'll be in the cabinet, and you would be right 96% of the time. That declines, not just in Koizumi, but it declines in general in the cabinets after electoral reform to 85%, which, again, it doesn't necessarily sound like a black and white difference. But if you're counting on being a cabinet member, that difference would certainly trouble you. And 7% become early, whereas none had been early before. So we do see a change. The rules are breaking down. Used to be you served your time, you got on the cabinet. Now other factors are becoming important. And again, it's crucial who gets into the cabinet. So what are these other factors? Making good policy and getting votes. And this is because the increased importance of the party label to the LDP. Whether you're voting in the proportional representation section where you simply choose a party, obviously the party label is important there, but even in the single member districts where you're choosing often between two candidates, the party label becomes more important than if you're choosing among multiple candidates of the same party. And because of that, we see phenomena such as outside experts being put into the cabinet. This is a huge change. By duration, so that's the number of days or years that a cabinet member is, that a non-legislator cabinet year. So we looked at all the years. And we see that by duration, this is rocketed up from a minuscule amount to a small amount. But still, even that small amount would be very troubling. Think about it. If you're in the LDP and somebody from the outside parachutes in and takes a cabinet post, they're taking your post. There better be a really good reason for that, or you're not going to sit still for that. Parties have broken up over the division of spoils over cabinet posts. LDP suffered a lot of internal friction and division because of this. So why would you tolerate it? Certainly they didn't tolerate it before. They're tolerating it now because policy making is relatively more important to the reputation of the LDP. It plays a bigger role in elections. And LDP backbenchers know this. So this is a clear indication of a very important change. Koizumi got a lot of credit for it, but it's been a change that preceded Koizumi and has continued after him. But he grasped it very well. Women. Now, this is something that touches on something that Professor Martin will talk about later on. But actually, women in the cabinet versus women in the electorate, women are now much more likely to be cabinet ministers. From 1955 to 1993, there were almost no women in the cabinet, 0.5%. That's jumped up to 10.5%, in part because there are more women. But even if we control for that, there's a huge, actually, all the characteristics you might have, being a former bureaucrat, winning huge in elections, coming from a marginal district, being a hereditary politician, all of those things. The most important single factor you could have going for you to get into the cabinet is your gender. And that's because the party image matters more. Again, Koizumi understood this very well, but it's a broader trend. Now let's look at the Abe cabinet. Let's see how well Abe exemplifies these trends compared to Koizumi and compared to the rest. His cabinet, and this is something that Shin will talk about later too, was criticized as the Friends of Shinzo cabinet. We also see that proportionality is high. Not a return to the averages of the before electoral reform, but higher than average. A lower number of early appointments, no late appointments, about average number of women, a little bit high, and a lower number of non-legislators than Fukuda and then Koizumi. So Abe exemplifies these trends, it's true, but he didn't seem to understand it as well as Koizumi. The numbers are lower. We can talk about perception as well, but we can show that along these important trends about how the cabinet composition affects votes, affects policymaking, Abe seems to be lagging behind Koizumi. Fukuda, on the other hand, seems to be doing better. Proportionality is lower than average and lower than Abe's cabinets. There are more early appointments and there are more non-legislators. So whatever we might say about these individuals, if we look at them as classes and think about how those categories of individuals affect the party's ability to win votes and make policy, Fukuda seems to have understood this more keenly than Abe. Let's not make too much about it, though, because Fukuda, Abe, and Koizumi cabinets are much more like each other than any of them are like the pre-reform cabinets. So this slide, I probably should have turned to this a few moments ago because I think it says what I just said. They're all part of a dramatic transformation, which Koizumi exemplified very well, but which others have also grasped, including those cabinets before Koizumi. Prime Minister and the vote. The Prime Minister's importance in elections has increased. This is something which Koizumi clearly understood. And this is for a couple of reasons. The electoral system, as I talked about in relation to the cabinet, which I think is a crucial interface between the party and the voter, the electoral system makes the party label more valuable now. And also, media attention, which states that before the electoral reform increasingly links the prime minister to the party image and calls away. You can see that TV's usefulness in vote decision in the House of Representative elections has increased steadily. We can see that it's the same in House of Councilors, Upper House. All these graphs are telling us that TV is more important to voters. And that matters because the face of the party on TV it's often the cabinet, but it's really the prime minister who benefits from this. And what it means is that the prime ministers, and you can see in these charts here, that gray one is the cabinet approval rate, which we can take as a proxy for the prime minister's approval rate. This black one, the black one is the LDP. So what people think of the LDP and the cabinet or prime minister used to be the same thing, which meant that they didn't really care who the prime minister was. They were one thing in their mind. But beginning with Nakasone, really, you can see these dramatic changes. There's a big gap that opens up between how people view the cabinet and how people view the party. Why is that? That's, I think, because of media. Because people have an independent view of the prime minister. And how they view the prime minister can affect their view of the party. It used to be simply that their view of the prime minister, the cabinet, reflected their view of the party. But now they can have a separate opinion because the media saturation has differentiated them in their minds. And their opinion about the prime minister, for example, or the cabinet can change how they feel about the party, which makes prime ministers more important in elections. Now, Koizumi clearly understood this. As all these big trends that are going on, Koizumi grasped them well, instinctively. You can think about the lost pension records and how Abe displayed a tin ear, didn't play that very well, how Koizumi may have turned that around and used that as an issue to beat up on the bureaucrats and win votes for his party. Koizumi really understood where these trends were going. But we're going to see that Abe, and well, we certainly saw with Abe, and Fukuda are also continuing these trends, as they were with the earlier trends. So the point, when we get beyond simply looking at Koizumi's success and Abe's failure, is that prime ministers are simply more important for elections now than they ever were before. And that's probably going to continue. What that implies is that prime ministers are going to be more often considered great, Koizumi, or terrible, Abe, and less often simply okay. That's because the prime minister is going to have a greater independent effect on the party's success. And so they're going to start being given responsibility. They're going to start being evaluated for that. So my conclusion is simply to restate what I have already told you. There are some fundamental changes that have transformed the prime minister, his role in the party. Koizumi was clearly understood those and in many ways best exemplifies those changes. Factions no longer determine the prime minister. That's still true. Cabinets matter more for elections. Koizumi grasped this, and you could see that in Koizumi's selection of cabinet ministers. Fukuda seems to know this better than Abe did. So again, I wouldn't make too much of it because they're still very different from the earlier reform pattern. But if you wanted to say Fukuda will probably be more successful in elections than Abe, or seems to know better what will lead to electoral success, this is some evidence in that direction. And this is particularly important for the fate of the LDP because the prime ministers matter more for elections because of TB and because of the party label. Which again leads us to there will be more great, like Koizumi, and more disastrous, like Abe prime ministers, fewer mediocre ones. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very well done, Dr. Pekkanen, and thank you for sort of laying the foundation for the speakers to come. And next up, yes, please, Dr. Fujihira.
Okay, so I'm the speaker without a PowerPoint,
It's too close.
oh, it's too close. Sorry, and I also have a very booming voice. So, but thank you very much to Mark and to Sui for inviting me to this panel. It's a privilege to be here with you. And also happy Halloween, and I hope my talk doesn't scare you very much. My assignment today was to talk about the Abe administration. So I'm going to talk about 5 aspects of the Abe administration, which probably are self-evident. And then I'm going to make an argument as to why these 5 aspects evolved the way they did. The 5 aspects, though, it's relatively short. I'll talk about Abe cabinet's conservative ideological ambition. I'll talk about its foreign policy. I'll talk about its economic policy. And, of course, scandals and verbal gaffes. My argument is that, somewhat similar to Dr. Pekkanen's argument, that Abe's leadership style fundamentally clashed with Japan's new political institutional environment. And what Japan has is, on the one hand, you have the administrative reforms of the Hashimoto cabinet in the mid-1990s, which provided significant leadership resources by strengthening the prime minister, by strengthening the cabinet office, by strengthening the cabinet secretariat. So the prime minister has significant powers to radically change a country's direction if she or he wants to do so. But there's another aspect of this, which is what Dr. Pekkanen talked about, which is the electoral reform of 1994, which basically makes the incumbent LDP prime minister the face of the election, so-called in Japanese senkyo no kao, against the opposition DPJ. And so what you have in this current institutional setup is that on the one hand, the prime minister has much more power in terms of top-down decision-making. On the other hand, the prime minister also bears significantly more responsibility for persuading the public in a bottom-up fashion because of the electoral reform 1994. And Abe often talked, sort of thought of his self-image as a fighting politician, tatakao seijika. But Abe's problem was that he was fighting for causes that didn't lead to votes. And Abe's problem was that he was fighting for causes that were ideologically divisive. And so what they tended to do was to consolidate support among those who had his ideological convictions. But he didn't really he was unable to persuade sort of broad group of the public who didn't really necessarily share his concerns. So that's the basic argument. So let me talk a little bit about each 5 aspects very briefly. First, it was short. Abe cabinet lasted for 366 days, which ranks as the 7th shortest tenure among the 28 prime ministers in Japan, post-war Japan, which is less than 1/3 of his grandfather, Kishi, less than 1/5 of his predecessor, Koizumi, and also it was shorter than the profoundly unpopular Mori cabinet, which lasted longer and which preceded the Koizumi cabinet. It's really important to remember that there is a dramatic contrast in the way this unfolded in September of 2006, and then what we saw in September of 2007. Abe cabinet's initial approval rating was at 71%. So in September of 2006. Of course, this is very familiar territory. He was 52, by far the youngest, and also the first prime minister to have been born after the Second World War. His distinguished family lineage of Kishi's grandson, Abe Shintaro's son, sort of provided a sense of grandeur to his image. He was young, but he also had national popularity because of his consistent position on abducted citizens by North Korea. So LDP's strategy at the time seems eminently plausible. That is to say that Abe might be young. He certainly leapfrogged the major party positions and so on. He didn't have a minister experience. He was chief cabinet secretary for a short period of time, but he really did not have much experience. But like Koizumi, the expectation was that he would be popular. And I think the expectation was that he would, of course, win the next House of Council election in July 2007. But I think the way Abe thought about this was he would probably fight the next 2 upper house elections and even perhaps next 2 lower house elections, sort of the way, Koizumi did. And I think that was the way he entered the cabinet in terms of, expectation that his rule is going to last. So it's very important to sort of remind ourselves, and, that was basically the expectation back in September, only a year ago. Now, the second aspect of Abe's administration is his conservative ideological ambition. And this is also, I think, fairly familiar territory. Abe's political language, beautiful country, utsukushii kunie, or breaking away from the post-war regime, Sengo regime kara no dakkyaku. This emphasized Japan's tradition, culture, and history. It also fundamentally questioned Japan's choices after the Second World War, and this was very distinctive. And Abe cabinet, and this is noted by many media commentators, so it's probably familiar to many of you, Abe cabinet actually does pass a lot of laws. And Abe cabinet actually passes a lot of conservative laws. And so, fundamental law of education was revised to emphasize tradition, culture, and publicly minded spirit. Abe used the newly Education Rebuilding Council, starting in October of 2006, to enact a series of education-related laws. Defense-related laws upgraded the Japan Defense Agency to Ministry of Defense, and also made self-defense forces one of the core missions as international missions, such as deployment in the Middle East and international peacekeeping operations. And finally, in terms of one important aspect of this is the passing of the national voting law, which was the first law in post-war Japan to provide legal foundations for voting procedures for referendum of constitutional reform. And I can talk more about that if you like. All of these have been pending legislative goals of the LDP since it's among the conservatives in the LDP since its founding in 1955. So these, should be thought of as, from the conservatives' perspective, really major accomplishments. But what was striking about Abe, there are two ways in which this is quite striking. One is that he is passing these laws with the majorities that were won by Koizumi. So he is passing these laws with the majority that Koizumi won in House of Representatives in 2005 and in House of Councilors in 2001 and 2004. So, Abe is using Koizumi's majorities because he had not yet been proven in an election. So Abe was using Koizumi's majorities to advance his conservative agendas. That's one thing that's striking. The other thing that's very striking is that if you look at public opinion polls, it was very clear that voters did not share Abe's legislative priorities. So just to give you a sense, at the time when Abe's cabinet was formed in October of 2006, this is a Yomiuri Shimbun poll, which is very useful. Voters can sort of say what their priorities were, and they can list as many as they want. And the top was Social Security reform, such as pensions and medical reform, at 59.2%. Next came business condition and job creation at 50.6%. And constitutional reform was distant at 5.7%. So already at the time of Abe cabinet's founding, Abe's voters are saying that that is not what they are, what their main interests are. And right after the upper house election, August of 2007, again the Yomiuri poll, Social Security reform is 65.1%, business condition and job creation is 51.7%, and constitutional reform is 7.4%. So what the voters are consistently showing is that their priorities have to do with economic and welfare issues, and not with the ideologically divisive issues that Abe chose to use Koizumi's political capital and legislative majorities. So this was a deliberate political decision, which in the end backfired for Abe. And, the basic point is that, Abe was never able to convince the public that the priorities of the beautiful country and the priorities of constitutional reform and education and so on, why they mattered more than issues relating to, economics and welfare. That's the second aspect. The third aspect is foreign policy. In foreign policy, it was distinctive because Abe did, and I think he does deserve credit for visiting China and South Korea October 8th and 9th. And it was also distinctive because he advanced what's called kachikan gaiko, or value-based diplomacy. The anecdote has it that it was raining when Abe went to China, but right when he stepped off the plane in Beijing, the rain immediately stopped. And that was sort of, a symbolic perhaps of what he was trying to do. It was also important because there was a joint press statement in which Japan-China relations was referred to for the first time as, quote, mutually beneficial relationship based on common strategic interests, or senryaku-teki gokei kankei, which was an upgrade. It's linguistic, but it's an important upgrade, I think, from a more usual and a mundane formula of peace and friendship. On the value-based diplomacy, Prime Minister John Howard of Australia visited Tokyo in March of 2007. There was the Japan-Australia Joint Declaration of Security Cooperation, which affirmed the two countries' commitment to upgrading their strategic cooperation. Abe, of course, visited India in late August to strengthen Japan's relations with India in both economics and also strategically. And, of course, he paid tribute to the dissenting judge of the Tokyo War Tribunal, Rapanad Pal. But all of this, I think, suggests that, Abe, of course, emphasized the U.S.-Japan alliance, but he also wanted to expand foreign policy options of Japan, which I think he takes credit. I think, in retrospect, what is quite fascinating is that he saw himself as a fighting politician, and this stance probably hurt him unexpectedly in U.S.-Japan relations. So the first one is, again, very familiar in this town, is that Abe reacted very strongly against the U.S. House Resolution 121, which condemned the Japanese government for not directly acknowledging its responsibility over the tragedy of the comfort women during the Second World War. And of course, Abe's personal views had been very well known. He had rejected the Kono statement of 1993 that acknowledged such responsibility. Then in March, he made a statement which is somewhat hard to translate. I tried my best. The translation, I think, is he said that the government, there was no evidence to say that there was coercion by the government in a narrow sense of the word, unquote, involving Japanese government's responsibility in the comfort of women. So he decided to fight this, and he didn't really have to fight this, but this was, he just could not keep quiet, I think, about this resolution. In which such statements further inflamed controversy in this country. So in the end, when Abe visited President Bush in Camp David in April, he had to express, remorse toward the issue of the comfort women. And this, I think, was very striking because this, I think it's quite rare. I think it's even maybe the first time that Japan's history problem with Asian countries actually became politicized. And it actually became a important topic of conversation between the United States and Japan. And actually, Abe was sort of, apologizing and expressing remorse about the comfort of women in the United States, not in Beijing or not in Seoul and so on and so forth. So this was, I think, quite striking instance in which he chose the fight, and he probably could not win that fight. Another fight, of course, is that after LDP lost the upper house election, it was obvious that any law that the government would try to pass would face opposition in the upper house. But he still pledged time and time again that he would fight to pass the anti-terrorism special measures law, the extension of ATSML, which ultimately, it was obvious that Ozawa was going to be confrontational. But again, he said he's going to fight for this. And so that was, again, a very interesting sort of political choice. And, again, in retrospect, I think that regarding those two issues in U.S.-Japan relations, I think that, these were not issues that there was, very much prospect of winning for Abe, but he still chose to fight these fights. The third aspect in terms of economics, the contrast is very clear, which is that, in contrast to bold initiatives on ideological issues in foreign policy, this remained very modest. And I think the main problem was Abe understood that there was reform fatigue in the electorate, after the Koizumi reform. And, there was fatigue, and also there was a sense that Koizumi's politics of destruction was not something that voters wanted. So Abe understood that, but it was also clear that he was not as committed to economic issues as the way he was committed to ideologically oriented issues. And so his, proposed measures, such as Challenge Again, Special Assistance Measures, or Asian Gateway, or Innovation 25, all of these led to important discussions, but voters never really could relate closely to these initiatives that Abe had. So he had a lot of initiatives with regards to economics, but then voters could never sort of relate to them. And of course, there's what Dr. Pekkanen and I'm sure others would mention, was the loss of over 50 million and perhaps even more pension records of the Social Insurance Agency. And of course, Abe is not directly responsible for that, but it was the way Abe responded to that in questions from DPJ that was a problem, that his responses suggested that he didn't want to incite fear among the Japanese public rather than getting to the bottom of how many records were being lost. So that really hurt him. And I sort of neglected to mention that one very important instance, which many of you know, and well, perhaps all of you know, is the allowing of return of the 11 LDP postal rebels in December of 2006, which led to questions about his commitment to to reform. And finally, in terms of scandals and gaffes, and this is perhaps when things sort of get interesting. Yes, I'll be done very soon. And thank goodness for all of you for that. As Dr. Pekkanen mentioned, I think that right when the cabinet was formed, there was, of course, a lot of criticisms. I tend to sort of translate Otomodachi Naikaku as cabinet of buddies, as opposed to FOS, but there's Otomodachi Naikaku and so on. And it basically sort of made his cabinet sort of susceptible to criticism, sort of, in Japanese, it's ronko kosho, so honoring past services and so on and so forth. Of the 17 cabinet ministers in the first cabinet, 11 entered the cabinet for the first time. 4 cabinet ministers, so Yanagisawa at health, Amari at economy, trade, and industry, Matsuoka at agriculture, and Yamamoto at financial services. They had vigorously campaigned for Abe during the LDP presidential election. Of course, there's the so-called Nice no Kai, the Nice Society, which sort of takes the top alphabets. So it's Nemoto, Abe, Ishihara, and Shiozaki, and they all had, major government and party posts. And on the one hand, there's the issue of sort of inexperience and youth, perhaps. But I think I've talked to a few LDP officials and members, and the sense is that there's also a sense that Abe was accelerating generational change within the party. That he was, it's not really just about factions, which I think is very important, but what was also important was that Abe was bringing his friends to the cabinet. He was very young, and he actually was sort of bypassing, it was not just him who was leapfrogging the LDP party hierarchy. He was actually also bringing in his friends to accelerate generational change. And I think that fear, was very important. The scandals are fairly well known, and I actually have a handout in the back about the chronology, so you can go through it. Probably the notable one was the health minister Yanagisawa's reference to women as childbearing machines, but it's very shocking was the suicide of Agriculture Minister Matsuoka, who really was the dawn of the LDP agricultural policy tribe. Due to, since he was pilloried for months by the media and the Diet. And of course, 2 agriculture ministers who followed also resigned or were sacked. And Defense Minister Kimaaki also made a few statements which were controversial. So, in conclusion, what's fascinating about the Abe administration is that there is this interaction between the 94 electoral reform and the Hashimoto administrative reforms. And I think that our previous understanding of this institutional mix was that they go very together. That is to say, the Prime Minister has a lot of power, and Prime Minister can also, LDP Prime Minister can also use that power to get elected. And I think Abe's administration changed that understanding, that if the Prime Minister were to choose the fights that the electorate does not want, then his cabinet is not going to last very long. And I think this also tells us something about conservatism in Japan today, that, it's not, I wouldn't say that constitution reform is unimportant to the electorate. But if a Japanese politician or prime minister wants to make issues like constitutional reform and education important, they actually also have to work on issues such as welfare and pensions first, or at least significantly, and then get to the long-term issues of education and constitution, because they're not going to give you votes for the LDP. And Abe's problem was that because he was so focused on issues like educational reform and constitution, that it was obvious that he seemed to be neglecting the very issues that the electorate cared about. So I think that's basically the lessons of the Abe administration. I'll be also happy to talk about Fukuda administration, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fujihira. And now to talk about the opposition party, Dr. Saito, who's probably not naturally oppositional. But
Thank you very much for providing me with the opportunity to talk about recent political development in Japan. So my presentation is titled as DPJ and Japan's Future. So DPJ is now basically in control of the upper house, and the future of any bills passing the legislature may rest on the hands of the DPJ people. And I will clarify who those people are. So basically, this is the official logo of the DPJ, by the way. And basically, I have the following 4 topics to explore with varying degree of emphasis. First of all, who are the DPJ people that defeated the Abe administration in the last upper house election? And second, in order to understand who are leading the DPJ today, I think we need to go back to the 1990s to understand the nature of the electoral reform, which made a transition from the old single non-transferable vote system, 추생격세, to the new 해릿세, or the combination of the PR and SMD. Third, let me provide a few explanations about the LDP's electoral loss in the last upper house election. Without that electoral loss, Abe could have survived as a prime minister anyway, and I would suspect that Abe would have pursued his own ideological agendas even further if the party had won the election. So the electoral loss terminated his ideological ambition anyway, but let me delve into the cause of that electoral loss a little bit further. Fourth, I will use the remaining time to provide some rough predictions about what will happen to the Japanese politics, both in the short run and in the long run, where the Japanese political system on the whole is facing increasing political clout of the Democratic Party of Japan. So, when the LDP lost the upper house majority control, I'd say that uninformed observers of Japanese politics might have been wondering if that change might lead to a significant radical change in Japanese politics. Well, we are not likely to observe a radical change in policy because the DPJ is basically oops. I haven't changed the slide. Enter? Yeah, sorry. Yeah. DPJ is basically a centrist coalition of defectors from pre-existing political parties, primarily the Liberal Democratic Party and JSP. And there are several descendants of the old party, which are DSP and Social Democratic League. And of course, the party consists of new entrants to the political arena since the early 1990s. Although there is a kind of heterogeneous mix of ideological preferences among DPJ incumbents, their firm, stable support base is their labor union. But given the fact that labor union density is low in Japan, the labor union is not enough for incumbents to win successive elections. And DPJ incumbents, as LDP incumbents have done in the past, develop their own personal support base as known as koenkai. And if politicians represent a large portion of the constituencies, something like 30%, 40%, 50% of the voters, they are very unlikely to specialize in a narrowly segmented ideological spectrum. So they are likely to be centrist, and that's what we observe. As I said, the DPJ politicians include a significant number of former LDP members. If so, one natural question is, in what sense those defectors from the LDP were different from folks that remain in the party? The first factor I can identify is the fact that those who defected from the LDP in 1993 were in favor of installing a new electoral institution. Another factor I can indicate, this is by the way based on my forthcoming article, but one factor is the importance of pork barrel politics in the past. So this map locates the distribution of LDP incumbents' hometowns as of 1992. And small dots, crosses and circles indicate those LDP representatives' hometowns. And blue squares indicate the location of Shinkansen station, bullet train stations. And we can see that LDP incumbents as of 1992 were scattered throughout the Japanese archipelago. The crosses indicate the location of the hometowns of those who defected from the party in 1993. We can see that there is a significant correlation between the location of bullet train stations and those who defected from the party in 1993. For instance, Ozawa's district is here in the southern domain of Iwate Prefecture. Once the Shinkansen highways are built in their district, there is very little thing for LDP incumbents to do in terms of poke-bowl politics. So Hata's district is here, Nagano's second district, and Nagano Shinkansen's construction was already committed when he defected from the party. On the other hand, there are very many LDP incumbents who are in favor of electoral reform, but those incumbents who are located distant from bullet trains were reluctant to defect from the party. So basically, all these DPJ incumbents formerly affiliated with the LDP tended to be elected from suburban districts, kind of rural cities which have access to nice transportation infrastructure. That was the kind of differences I can see. But I would say that there was very little ideological differences between those who remained and those who defected from the party. So basically, the DPJ was a combination of alliance between the suburban and urban voters, whereas LDP was a coalition of rural districts, incumbents elected from rural districts and urban districts, whose electoral support base was enhanced by forging a coalition between the Komeito party. And I can say that postal reform anomaly in 2005 was a short-run deviation from the underlying trend of the LDP's long-term decline. So anyway, the DPJ won the last upper house election, and the LDP suffered a remarkable loss. Then how can we explain that loss? I can provide several institutional structure factors as well as short-run exogenous shocks like eruption of scandals. Let me provide three hypotheses. One is related to Koizumi reform in terms of reducing subsidies going to local government. The other is voters' coordination behavior in terms of JCP's decline. The third factor is LDP leaders' maladroit electioneering activities. And let me try to draw some implications for the next lower house election. So my first explanation is based on reform in the local government. After the Koizumi administration was established, the government actively pursued downsizing of local government. They reduced subsidies going to local governments, prefectures, and municipalities. In addition to that, they encouraged the merger of municipalities. When Koizumi won the first upper house election in 2001, there were about 3,247 municipalities. The number of municipalities as of the last upper house election was something like 1,834. And there was about 35 to 40% reduction in the number of municipalities. Since small population municipalities tend to have a larger number of per capita municipal assembly members, municipal managers radically reduced the number of municipal assembly members who are virtually paid activists for the LDP. I can comfortably say that about 60 to 70% of the municipal assembly members are working as LDP's local organizers and activists. So the total number of municipal assembly members was about 80,000 in the late 1990s, but the number was reduced to something like 50,000. So there was a sizable reduction. And the reduction in the number of municipalities in terms of mergers affected the LDP's performance in a moderate way. So when I took a look at the electoral statistics by comparing the 2007 last election and 2001 upper house election, there was overall decline of 12% among municipalities which did not underwent merger. But the reduction in merger among municipalities, the reduction in the vote share, the LDP vote shares in municipalities that underwent merger was something like 15.3%. So there was 3.3% difference in LDP's electoral performance. This is only a rough descriptive statistics, but we need to do a little bit more of sophisticated statistical analysis. But let me show you the trend in terms of using graphics. So the vertical axis is the change in the LDP's vote share by comparing 2001 and 2007 election. And the horizontal axis, this is the change in the mean municipal population size. Given the fact that the Japanese population on the whole is not growing fast, the change in the municipal population size is originated by encouraging municipal merger. So in prefectures that encountered a lot of municipal mergers, the LDP tended to perform poorly in comparison with prefectures where there were very few occasions of municipal mergers, although the effect was not so sizable as pundits were arguing immediately after the upper house election. Another feature which I think will have more important implications for thinking about the next lower house election is JCP's long-term decline. First of all, after the collapse of the socialist regimes in East Europe, the party has had difficulty in recruiting young activists. And in addition, voters are behaving strategically to coordinate their dissatisfaction against the LDP. Take a look at the decline in the JCP's vote share by prefecture. So the vertical axis is the change in that party's vote share, and the horizontal axis is the change in the winning margin. So if you go to this direction, the winning margin is increasing, which means that the competitiveness of the district races is declining. If you go to this direction, the winning margin is decreasing, which means that the elections are becoming more competitive. Since the Communist Party is not viable candidate for winning the seat in most of the prefectures in upper house elections, we can say that increasing competitiveness pertain more to the competition between the LDP and the DPJ. And in prefectures that where the competition between the LDP and DPJ became harsher, the JCP tend to lose more votes. Whereas in prefectures where either the DPJ or the LDP are winning with a comfortable margin, the JCP is no longer reducing their votes, which indicates a little bit of what is called strategic voting, but we need to do a little bit more careful statistical analysis to identify real causal mechanism. But we observe this kind of trend, which will have some implications for thinking about next lower house election. Well, the JCP also has made an announcement that the party will withdraw some of the candidates in some of the districts, and non-LDP voters will may more easily coordinate their dissatisfaction facing electoral competition. Explanation number 3 is Abe simply did poorly in terms of electioneering tactic. They failed to contain scandals. And in addition, unlike Koizumi, who took advantage of internal party strife, Abe couldn't hide the Democratic Party of Japan from public eye. Koizumi was a political genius in the sense that he took advantage of the strife of Teiko Seiryuku opposition forces within the party and reformist camp to hide the DPJ from media appearance. But Abe didn't do that. Abe pursued more or less a bipartisan policy debate style of electioneering. And it was in that sense DPJ attracted a lot of public attention. And in addition, the LDP's electoral ads was simply poor, in the sense that we saw a lot of this kind of posters in hinterlands where municipalities are suffering from chronic population decline and negative income growth. So the LDP's catchphrase was something like "make growth real," but this kind of electoral poster seen in rural areas might have looked really cynical to long-time supporters of LDP who were suffering from the negative effect of the Koizumi reform. On the other hand, the DPJ's party head, Ozawa Ichiro, campaigned exclusively in rural areas. The size of audience was not large. He made speeches before the public of something like 100 and 200 citizens. In many of the villages he visited during the election time. But on the other hand, local TV stations and local news media covered Ozawa's visit fairly extensively. And it was in that sense he earned a lot of sympathy votes among rural folks. In contrast, Abe always attracted an audience of about 3,000, especially in urban areas. But it is said that those audience were mainly mobilized participants from Soka Gakkai and construction companies, and that large audience did not necessarily lead to the LDP's votes. So what's the implication for the next lower house election? Well, there can be a lot more things to think about. We need to recognize the fact that the upper house is heavily overrepresenting rural population. Given the fact that malapportionment is less a severe problem in the lower house, the DPJ will need to think about how to win more of urban support. And since urban voters' behavior is unpredictable, we need to think about what will happen. There is a lot of uncertainty regarding the next lower house election. Media bias, given the increasing important role of mass media, we need to think about the bias of the media itself. And, well, there are a few other theories about DPJ's easy winning of the next election. As I said, JCP supporters are voting strategically. They are less likely to vote for the LDP. They are potential providers of marginal swing votes for the DPJ. And in addition, LDP has somehow exhausted their electoral stars. Koizumi took advantage of the internal strife, but on the other hand, most of the rising stars in the opposition camp within the party lost their footing within the party because of the harsh fights within the party. And as many panelists have already identified, there is reform fatigue feeling among long-time LDP supporters. It is in that sense, there is substantial high probability of the DPJ taking over the cabinet after the next lower house election. So in the short run, yes, the DPJ is in control of the upper house. And this Tuesday, Prime Minister Yasuo Fukuda failed to persuade Ichiro Ozawa to agree on a new anti-terrorism bill which will enable the Maritime Self-Defense Force to continue fueling multinational naval ships in the Indian Ocean. This kind of legislative stalemate will persist for a long time. But on the other hand, there is going to be a very little change in the fundamental features of U.S.-Japan relations or fundamental structure of Japanese politics. Even if the DPJ will take over the cabinet, I would expect that there is an enhancement in terms of accountability, but the fundamental structure of Japanese politics is unlikely to change. This is my hopeful speculation about the future of Japanese politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saito. Okay, and now batting cleanup, or the goalie. So she's much more of a hockey fan than a baseball fan. Dr. Martin, on the electorate itself.
Okay, I'd like to begin by taking this opportunity to thank Mark Moore and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars for this opportunity to share some of my thoughts about contemporary Japanese politics with you. The title of my talk, Japanese Political Attitudes Against the Evolving Political Landscape, refers to, first, by evolving landscape, a series of interlocking social demographic changes that have been unfolding in Japan over decades, the consequences of which are now reaching crisis proportions. So specifically, a rapidly aging society, low birth rates, a shrinking labor force, widening economic disparities between urban and rural Japan, and a pension system in danger of collapse. All of these changes are taking place against a parallel backdrop of institutional changes, electoral administrative reforms, for example, and these changes shift channels of interest articulation through which Japanese voters express their mounting insecurity, anger, and discontent. Excuse me. In this presentation, I use gender as a lens for examining whether changes on both fronts, socioeconomic and institutional, are promoting, as proponents of electoral reform had originally hoped, an issue-based cleavage structure that can then structure two-party dominant electoral competition. I briefly examined two issue dimensions, defense and security and social welfare, that tend to produce gender gaps in attitudes and voting in democracies cross-nationally. While an emergent gender gap in politics can be negatively viewed as a symptom of chronic inequality in Japanese politics, the expression of gender-based differences where none previously existed can suggest that the Japanese system is successfully providing an outlet for the expression and the debate of alternative viewpoints. I'm going to begin and end this short presentation with some observations about an emerging gender gap in voting in Japanese politics. Prior to the upper house election this past July, journalist David Pilling was among political observers who expected women's votes to be decisive. Specifically, many wondered what women who typically did not identify with any party in the system, so throughout this talk I'll refer to them as unaffiliated voters or nonpartisans. So people wondered, these voters who were nonpartisans, but who supported Koizumi supposedly in previous elections, what would these women do, given a less optimal choice between an LDP headed by Abe and the DPJ? While gender supposedly mattered in the lead up to the 2007 elections, what's really curious is that immediately afterwards, gender was not reported as decisive. This was partly because everyone, all voters, male and female, penalized the LDP. Nonetheless, this does not mean that gender did not matter, and it leaves the questions of how it mattered specifically largely unaddressed. And I take up this matter by looking at the 2005 election as a means of providing some insight into the role of gender in elections earlier this year, and to offer some predictions for the next lower house election. So in some respect, this is more of a retrospective talk in terms of let's look at what happened in 2005 to shed some perspective on what happened earlier this year and to think about what we can expect in the upcoming House of Representatives election. Now, in terms of the battle for women's votes, I want to talk a little bit about why this was significant. Unaffiliated voters, who range between, depending on when you ask, when voters are polled, between 1/4 and 1/2 of the Japanese electorate. And what I mean by it depends on when people are asked is that as elections are closer, they're more proximate, it's weighing heavily on people's minds. So party identification tends to go up both immediately before and immediately after elections. But if you ask any time between, then it tends to go down. And a large proportion of unaffiliated voters introduces a lot of electoral uncertainty and volatility. So parties are really concerned about this because if you are, let's say, the LDP that continues to win elections with a shrinking base of support, so the LDP over time has seen fewer and fewer voters in its support base, but it still continues to win a majority of seats in the lower house. But as the proportion of unaffiliated voters also increases, then it really presents some problems for the LDP and other parties in the system that are trying to predict their fortunes in upcoming elections. We found that of this percentage of unaffiliated voters, women constitute a majority. And because they're a majority of unaffiliated voters, so if we're looking at any given time that, let's say, 40% of the electorate is unaffiliated, within that 40%, over half, nearly 60%, sometimes are women. So that means that women have the potential to inflate their influence during voting, during electoral competition. And parties should have an incentive to appeal to women to garner a larger share of votes. Unaffiliated voters, when they do turn out the vote, the LDP usually suffers. And this was most clearly expressed by former Prime Minister Mori, who earned even more criticism than usual when he expressed the hope that unaffiliated voters would stay home in 2001. And when this could be interpreted as code for if women voters stay home, we'll do okay. And while but this is also really important because gender gaps is important to political scientists and people who look at gender and political participation because at least in Japan, gender gaps in attitude and vote choice have typically been insignificant. But while there has been no difference in vote choice, it's increasingly evident that the paths by which men and women arrive at their electoral choices are different. LDP dominance is the primary reason, or has been a primary reason, that there's not a gender gap. But the emergence of new parties in the system has made it clear that partisanship amongst women is softer. So what I mean by softer is that they're, again, more likely to be nonpartisans. And even when they are party identifiers, they tend to exhibit weaker partisan ties. They don't say, gosh, I'm a really strong supporter of the LDP or the DPJ. So the gender gap in Japan is more of a gap in affective or psychological orientation towards parties that's not immediately evident in vote choice or issue positions. Now, one question that I want to take up today is, did Koizumi really win over unaffiliated women? And could we have predicted the outcome of the 2007 upper house election, given what we know about gender, party ID, and issue positions during the 2005 lower house election? Specifically, since Koizumi was so supposedly popular amongst women voters, one thing that we're really interested in is, did this popularity transfer to Abe? It seems that it didn't. And did this popularity perhaps rub off a little bit on the party, the LDP? And it seems that it didn't. But at least in 2005, there was a lot of evidence to support this notion that Koizumi was very popular amongst women voters across the board and did bring in more unaffiliated women to the party. Primarily because, first of all, the issues that framed the 2005 election, so postal reform and pension scandal, they fit broadly under themes of corruption and welfare that resonate strongly with women voters, not just in Japan, but elsewhere. And also, Koizumi ran female assassins against postal rebels who were LDP veterans. So Koizumi ran a high number of female candidates, and research in the US, for example, and elsewhere has shown that when there are women in the race, then at least that functions to engage women voters in that particular race. This is just more of an FYI, just to give you a sense of the data sources that I'm pulling from. I'm a survey methodologist. These are national level election surveys conducted in Japan over a period of roughly 30 years. You'll notice that there's a lot of overlap in terms of the principal investigators. And also I put this up here to just let you know that the Japanese Voter, a book published by Yale University Press in 1991, has helped me to think about some of these issues. And that particular publication was edited by many of the names that you see here. Okay, I want to just give you a sense of how large the differences in voting patterns among women are among men and women who aren't affiliated with a party compared to those who are, and answer this question of whether unaffiliated women really turned out to vote for the LDP. Now, these are predicted probabilities that I generated with a multinomial logistic regression, but don't worry about that. I would be happy to answer any questions. And I predicted probabilities for vote choice in the 2005 lower house election among men and women with party identification expressed before in a pre-election survey as my predictor variable. And there are large and significant differences amongst non-identifiers. Okay, so if you were a man and you didn't express support for any party prior to the election, the chances of your voting for the LDP was almost 60%. If you're a woman and that is none, the category none, that did not identify with a party before the 2005 election, your chances of voting for the LDP was about 35%. Conversely, again, looking at the none category, one thing that I want you to also notice here is that if you look at party identifiers, women who identified with LDP and men who were LDP party identifiers, they had roughly the similar chances of voting for the LDP, the same for the DPJ, and pretty much the same if you were a minor party identifier. The major differences are in the category of non-party identifiers. So if you look at women who are unaffiliated voters prior to the 2005 election, and then in terms of predicting their vote choice, if you're an unaffiliated woman, you're more likely to vote for the DPJ. So again, there was a 65% chance that an unaffiliated woman would vote for the DPJ. Again, for men, it was just over 40%. So that means that even when Koizumi was popular, unaffiliated women were still more likely to support the Liberal Democratic Party. Unidentified women were still more likely to support the Democratic Party of Japan, the DPJ. And again, I'm going to say they constituted a sizable proportion of the electorate. So prior to this particular election, and again, this is when Koizumi was popular, you still had nearly a quarter of voters who didn't identify with a party. And I also want to stress that this difference, this particular finding that I'm reporting, is significant because the media, so in trying to contextualize the earlier quote that I put up from David Pilling, in which he said that that the DPJ had an image problem amongst women, and that he wasn't sure that women were going to turn out in 2007 for the DPJ. This difference in 2005, 2 years earlier, was largely undetected. And this is because, in terms of overall rates of support, if you ask people which party you supported prior to the 2005 election, it's true that men were more likely to say that they identified with the DPJ. So 24.2% of men compared to 16.8% of women expressed DPJ support prior to the election. But the difference disappears when it came to voting. 31.1% of men and 29.8% of women, at least in my sample, voted for the DPJ. So there's no difference in actual voting. But what accounts for this gap narrowing between how many people say, yes, I identify, I support the party, and then actually turning out to vote, is these are the swing voters, these non-affiliated voters, these nonpartisans, who beforehand aren't picking up that they're going to actually turn out and vote for the DPJ, but then they actually turn out and do so. Now, in terms of explaining these differences, I suggest that we need to look at issue positions, specifically gender-based differences in attitudes about defense and security. And I say that we should look at these for a couple of reasons. First, there's traditionally been a gap on this issue, and women were, especially since women were active participants in the peace and anti-nuclear movements. But at the same time, this is a traditional issue position. This is a traditional position issue, meaning that voters actually did see two sides to the problem, but it was one that was low salience, at least as suggested by authors of The Japanese Voter based on their analysis of a 1976 election. And so what this means is that this wasn't an issue that parties used to mobilize the electorate. In fact, in the aftermath of the 1960 crisis, the LDP promoted GMPism to diffuse this issue and refocus attention on economic growth instead. But recent events in Iraq, for example, and the feared closing of the U.S. security umbrella have returned defense and security to the center stage. So in less than a decade, men in particular have become increasingly in favor of strengthening defense. Now, this is not a contradiction to what my colleagues have said earlier in terms of asking the electorate what issues do you think are really important. It's still the case that they think that social welfare, economic reforms are a priority. But everyone agrees that those things are a priority. When it really comes down to it in terms of making a decision between the two parties, however, suddenly issues such as defense that might not be a priority become the straw that breaks the camel's back for some voters. Similarly, attitudes about strengthening the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, those have been changing over the last 3 decades, but again, the trends here are a little less sharp. They're a little less clear. And I think that that's driven by just sort of differences in perspectives depending on how you as a respondent consume this particular question. So whether or not you agree or disagree with strengthening the U.S.-Japan Security Agreement depends on whether you, as an individual, think that it's already perfect, just right, not strong enough, or is too strong. Nonetheless, there are still noticeable differences here between men and women. I'm just going to go through this slide really quickly. I apologize because it's very, very small, but this is more or less there just to give you an idea of what it was that I did in generating a lot of my results. So there are a series of items that respondents were asked across all of these surveys in terms of do you agree or disagree on all of these different issues. Okay, so at the top you had agree, disagree, Japan should strengthen its military defense capabilities. Even if Japan has to make concessions, it should quickly resolve any trade disputes. Social welfare, such as pensions and medical care for the elderly, should be fulfilled as much as possible, even when public finances are suffering, so on and so forth. I did a principal components analysis to identify underlying structures amongst these issues that survey respondents were thinking about. So I wanted to know whether there were certain issues that tended to cluster together in the minds of voters. And I found 5 different clusters, and I named them. The first was reform, foreign relations, defense, social equality, and welfare. Now, when I ran a regression to figure out, so even though reform and foreign relations are reform is highly salient. Foreign relations, everyone tends to agree that we would like to have easier relations with our neighbors. That's an important thing. Because there's a lot of agreement on those, they don't have a lot of explanatory factor, a lot of explanatory power in predicting vote choice. But they come out in terms of being very coherent issue clusters. So when I ran a regression, what really came out as being very important was defense. And to me, this was a surprise. And when I ran this with just within women and men, then I found that defense was the thing that was very important for both male and female voters, but social welfare mattered more for women. So to give you an idea of how this matters, this is a graph of the impact of social welfare on vote choice by gender. The top two lines are your LDP supporters. The solid lines are men. The dotted lines are your women. The bottom two lines are your DPJ supporters. What this is saying is that if you are a man, whether you agree or you disagree with the statement that everyone should live without welfare, it didn't matter in terms of your vote choice. But if you were a woman, if you had stronger preferences in terms of the opposite of this statement, if you felt that welfare was something that should be extended to everyone generally, then you were more likely to support the DPJ. And this is the impact of defense on vote choice by gender, with whether or not you agree that Japan should strengthen its military defense capabilities. And again, the top two lines are men and women LDP supporters who voted for the LDP, and men and women who voted for the DPJ. And there's a clear difference here between your LDP and your DPJ supporters, but not so much between men and women, at least in terms of agreement with this statement. The differences opened with disagreement. So women who felt really strongly about this and disagreed were more likely to support the DPJ and less likely to support the LDP. Now, the problem with both of these graphs is that they both suggest that voters who somewhat disagree don't really see that much of a difference between the two parties. And those who can't say, which is a lot of voters who just can't tell a difference, or they don't really have a position on this issue quite yet, they're playing it safe and they're voting for the LDP. So I just want to conclude with some lessons from 2005 that I hope sheds perspective on what happened earlier this year and can serve as a basis for some predictions for the next House of Representatives election. First, despite its supposed unpopularity amongst women voters, the DPJ was the party of choice amongst unaffiliated women, even when Koizumi's appeal was presumably strong. And I found this a quite surprising result. So movement toward the DPJ in 2007, at least amongst women voters, could have been predicted based on patterns evident in the 2005 House of Representatives election. So again, that people thought that the DPJ wouldn't do well in the last election is actually contrary to what actual trends suggest. And further, DPJ's success is contingent upon its ability to define its position on salient issues, such as defense and welfare, and to drive a wedge between the LDP and voters who are inclined to disagree with the dominant party. In this regard, I think that the DPJ was quite strategic, quite savvy, in really making renewal of anti-terrorism legislation a high-profile issue, even though it wasn't something that voters cared about a lot. It was a way of distinguishing the party from the LDP on an issue that was increasing in salience. administration of social welfare has the potential to become a position issue, but right now it's tainted by corruption, and because of that, it continues to operate as a valence issue. So everyone was upset by corrupt social welfare administration practices, but women were more likely to vote on the basis of perceived substantive differences in social welfare policy. In 2005, the DPJ won support from unaffiliated women without having to establish a substantive position. So, in other words, all they had to do, was say, "These are the problems. We're going to expose the scandal. We're not going to really tell you substantively how our social welfare reform package will differ significantly from that of the LDP. We're not going to offer any details. We don't really have to. All we have to say is that the LDP has really messed up, so perhaps you'll give us a chance." While political and economic reform and social welfare headed the agenda in both 2005 and 2007, security and defense issues attained greater importance among unaffiliated voters seeking substantive alternatives. So in 2005, if you were strongly opposed to strengthening Japan's military defense capabilities, and you held reservations about the alliance with the U.S., you supported the DPJ, and this continued to be the case in 2007, and there's no reasons to suspect that this won't be the case if things continue as they are in the next House of Representatives election. And finally, I just want to take up one point that was raised by my colleague, Professor Pekkanen. In 2000, in terms of taking a page from Koizumi's book, it seems that the DPJ did this quite well, even though I don't think that the DPJ has gotten a lot of credit for this. So whereas Koizumi gained a lot of attention for running female assassin candidates who then went on to win a seat in the lower house of the Diet, and while he got a lot of credit for appointing many women to his cabinet, in this election, women also won a record number of seats, getting 26 additional seats, and that increases the overall total to 44 in the upper house. But 14 of these seats were won by DPJ women candidates, and when you look at how many women were already from the DPJ in the upper house, that means that 50% of women in the upper house are from the DPJ. Also, another just point that was really interesting is that a DPJ woman faced off against an LBP woman in Yamagata and defeated her. So in terms of using women as a means of perhaps attracting the attention of more female voters, establishing some credibility amongst voters that gender equality, improving the status of women could be something that is important. The DPJ is definitely making strides in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. Well, I think that was a really wonderful broad view of what's going on in Japan today and what happened since Koizumi and back through the 90s. So I take it some people have some questions. So if you have comments, make them short. Remember, subject to a global audience. And let's just ask one question. And if you have another, wait for the Thanksgiving rule. Wait till everybody's had first. Dr. Seligman. Oh, okay. Hold on. Wait for the microphone because it's being broadcast. Just state your name and affiliation, please.
Albert Seligman, retired Foreign Service officer who loved to observe Japanese elections for many years. I was much intrigued by Dr. Pekkanen's correlation between the popularity or lack thereof of the LDP and of prime ministers. It wasn't up there long enough to study it in detail, which is something I'd like to do. But two thoughts occurred to me, and I'd welcome your comments or those of other panelists, that there were two factors that entered into this that you didn't quite address. One is certainty, and the other is corruption. Now, at the beginning of that graph, where the correlation is lovely, it's like the chirps of a cricket in temperature, there was almost a blood oath from Kishi period on through Ikeda on the succession. Everybody knew who the next prime minister was going to be. In fact, aside, it was a blood oath. But in any case, that took care of almost 20 years. And then related to that is corruption. There was corruption during that period, big scandals, but the certainty outweighed the corruption. Then you have corruption that gave rise to uncertainty. It was very interesting when the Kaifu's popularity spiked way up and the LDP, I can't remember, went down or stayed about the same. He was about the only politician at the time who was not tainted by corruption. They had no other choice. He was only able to put in one other member of his own faction in the cabinet, whom he didn't particularly like. But I won't rant on here because it would take too long, but I wonder how you feel about those other factors that give rise to this disparity as time moves on. And certainly you could talk about corruption in the very recent past and uncertainty.
Would you like me to respond to that? Thank you very much for that question. And it asks something I haven't really thought about, so I'll just give you my off-the-cuff response. And if there's certainty in the earlier period that disappears in a later period, then it's difficult to separate out in the data whether it's the certainty or the lack of media exposure that's driving the difference between these results. However, if it's the certainty, then I would tend to believe that it's the variation comes from television exposure, because certainty also implies that they're indifferent between the alternatives, who comes after. It doesn't really matter, because if you want the person after and you want the person now to get out, then you could have a divergence, and which is the basic point, that it doesn't really matter who's coming around. So certainty, for that to be the motive force here, I think it would also be predicated upon a relative indifference, which is, after all, the basic point behind the change to when the differentiation. So that's a particularly prolix way of saying I think it's TV. In terms of corruption, there is a lot of corruption. You probably know much better than I. Corruption is not new. And so we would expect to see, if it was really corruption driving it, that the dissociation spikes at certain periods and then collapses. It goes along with certain scandals. And that's not the pattern we observe. So I think that I'll have to reflect on it more, but I still think that it's really the growth of media, the ability of the prime minister to get his or her, or in all cases his, face onto TV more, have it burn that image in, brand that image into the viewers, into the electorate, that's driving this gap between how viewers view the prime minister through the cabinet and the party as a whole.
Thank you. I'm Andrew Oros from Washington College. Excuse my voice, I have a cold. As many of you know, I'm interested in Japanese defense policy, and I've been listening to sort of correlations or allusions to this. And I think I basically agree with, it seems all of you are making the point that the Japanese public is really not that interested in defense policy compared to welfare policy and pension reform. And that, I think, is not a very good message to be telling in Washington, because I think in Washington people expect that Japan is going to do much more in defense. And so I think for that reason, Mr. Abe was quite popular in Washington, because he said what we wanted to believe, even though I think he said more than what the Japanese government was going to be able to deliver. And so I wonder, now that we have Mr. Fukuda, it seems to me that all of your analysis would suggest that for the LDP to do well, it should focus more on welfare policy and pension reform and these things, and then, if it can, do some more conservative agenda, do that on the side. And so I'm wondering, is that what you think will happen? Is that what Mr. Fukuda will do? Or is the U.S. relationship so important that perhaps that will change the calculus?
Thank you, Andrew. I didn't mean to say that the Japanese public doesn't care about defense policy. I think it's the particular way in which Abe went about the issues which mattered for Abe was, issues like education. I mean, constitutional reform is, of course, it's Article 9, it's defense related, but I didn't really mean to say that, the public was not interested in defense. The issue right now is that, Ozawa and Fukuda had a meeting yesterday, just the two of them. It was a striking meeting. It was widely reported. The secretary generals of the two parties weren't in a meeting, and nobody knows what happened. And there are a lot of talks about whether it could be grand coalition.
Two people at the meeting.
Well, I think that, Ozawa was kind of flippant about it in terms of, Ozawa basically said nothing happened in the meeting. But I think the current situation is very fluid, and I think, Ozawa's position, and maybe Jun can also talk about this, is, DPJ is, as we all know, is very divided on issues of defense, and there are a lot of people in DPJ that agrees with LDP on defense issues. And Ozawa's position also is a rather cryptic one, that somehow Japan should not be refueling in the Indian Ocean, but it should be in ISAF within Afghanistan. So that's because that's as long as it's somehow UN related, that it doesn't really lead to use of force, national use of force by Japan. So I didn't really mean to say that. And Fukuda is going to likely come to the United States in middle of November, and that basically is to show that he does care about U.S.-Japan relations. He's seen as somebody who's leaning more towards, or at least sympathetic to China, and of course much more moderate on issues of China and the history issue and relations with Korea and so on. And I think Fukuda chooses U.S. as the first destination because I think he wants to show that. So. But anyways, I'll stop there.
Yeah, just make one comment. I believe it was Tip O'Neill who said all politics is local. So first you have to, shore up the base before you can run around with foreign adventures. Take note, somebody. But anyway, would anyone else like to comment?
Yeah. So I think the matter is to what extent what level of perception about defense issue is enough. If you compare the long time series of Japanese public opinion regarding defense issues or constitutional revision, we see an increasing trend of Japanese public taking more proactive position about foreign policy or constitutional revisions or national security issues. If you take a look at the difference between the 1980s and today, that difference is, I would say, significant. But seen from Washington, D.C., the current level might not qualify as sufficient. That's my take on this issue. And regarding Ozawa's stance about the renewal of the anti-terrorism bill, I think Ozawa is a difficult politician to make sense of. On one end, he is regarded as a fundamentalist in issues like electoral reforms and political reforms. For instance, he has been advocating installment of single-member district system ever since he ran for election in 1969. But on the other hand, he's a Machiavellist and pragmatist. He made a lot of compromises and concessions whenever he faced political crisis that might led him to lose his political career. And I'm not sure in what sense his advocacy of multilateralism originates from his fundamental political preference or political needs within the party. I think we need to make an assumption about that to draw a conclusion about the consequence of the bargaining process.
Yeah, I just like to add that I do believe that the Japanese government, whoever is in charge, will have a lot more leeway on foreign policy, if, again, echoing what people have said, if they can solve a lot of the social welfare issues first. But one thing that I did want to mention that I think is very curious with women voters, and I think it's something to be explored, is the extent to which at least women see this as a trade-off between social welfare and defense. And that men don't see this as a trade-off, as during economically strapped times, if money is going towards security and defense or foreign aid outside of the country, how does this actually take away from our ability to shore up, let's say, our pension system, to expand social welfare services at a time when we're economically strapped and population, sort of demographic changes suggest that it's going to be even harder in the future to generate funding from this for this internally.
Well, I think we could look at this a couple of different ways. Abe was a failure because his security policies failed, or his security policies failed because he failed. After all, Koizumi did a lot, and he was wildly popular. So I think that Fukuda actually could do quite a bit, and he's no dove. That's where I would leave it.
Any other questions? All right, if there are no other questions, I want to thank you for coming. Good luck with